Hi everybody. This PowerPoint demonstrates different types of interfund transactions through a series of examples. Remember, there are three major types of interfund transactions. The first, a reciprocal exchange, is when one fund purchases goods or services from another fund. In general, the purchasing fund would record the purchase as an expenditure or an expense, and the selling fund would record the purchase as a revenue. A non-reciprocal exchange, also known as an interfund transfer, is when resources are transferred one way from one fund to another, not in exchange for any good or service. So it may be transfer of cash, or it may be the transfer of other resources or assets. Finally, an interfund loan is when resources or assets are transferred from one fund to the other with the intention that the receiving fund will pay it back in the future, either in the short term or in the long term. We already in Deck 2 saw one example of an interfund transaction. This was a non-reciprocal exchange or an interfund transfer between the Capital Projects Fund and the Debt Service Fund when we were required to transfer bond proceeds from the Capital Projects Fund to the Debt Service Fund because there were restrictions on the government's use of the bond proceeds. Example 2. A city transfers cash derived from general property taxes from its general fund to its debt service funds because it intends to use the money for payment of debt service on general obligation bonds. This would be a second non-reciprocal exchange. It's a one-way transfer of resources from the general fund to the debt service fund. We record the entry as a transfer out in the general fund. The account other financing uses transfers out is an income statement account like an expenditure account. And we record the transfer in the debt service fund as a transfer in. The account other financing sources transfers in is, again, an income statement account like a revenue account. We make no entries in the governmental activities because both the general fund and the debt service fund are part of the governmental activities. So this event is totally internal to the governmental activities. Example 3, a third non-reciprocal exchange. In this case, the city transfers $5,200,000 in cash from its general fund to its golf course enterprise fund to subsidize the operation of the golf course. Again, it's a non-reciprocal exchange because it's a one-way transfer of resources, not with the assumption that it will be repaid and not for the purchase of goods or service. So we record the entry in the general fund in the golf course enterprise fund, pretty much as we did before for the last example. But in this case, because the general fund is a governmental fund and the golf course fund is an enterprise fund, this transfer is a transfer between the governmental activities and the business type activities, and we would make an entry in both the governmental activities and the business type activities. We record the transfer from the governmental activities to the business type activities by debiting an account transfers in the governmental activities and crediting that same account transfers in the business type activities. It's much like the account, in effect, it's much like the account other financing sources transfers out and transfers in, but in the case of the governmental activities and business type activities, we just use this single account transfers. Example 4, this case an interfund loan. Here the city is loaning $1 million from its general fund to its golf course fund with the expectation that it will be repaid in 10 years. So in this case, in the general fund, we record the loan by recording an asset, interfund loan receivable non-current of $1 million. And in the golf course fund, we record an interfund loan payable of $1 million to recognize the liability from the golf course fund to the general fund. Again, because this is a transaction that crosses over between the governmental activities and the business type activities, we need to make an entry in both the governmental activities and the business type activities. In this case, the payable from the business type activities to the governmental activities is recorded using the account internal balances. Next, because The loan is not expected to be repaid to the general fund in the current period. The general fund has to recognize the fact that that receivable is non-spendable. So this requires an adjustment to the fund balance account. So we adjust fund balance by debiting unassigned fund balance by $1 million, that is reducing unassigned fund balance, and crediting non-spendable fund balance by $1 million, that is increasing non-spendable fund balance by $1 million. Total fund balance has remained unchanged, but within total fund balance, we've reclassified $1 million from unassigned to non-spendable, and that indicates to the city that that portion of fund balance cannot be used for budgeting on a current basis. We make no entries in the governmental activities because we don't record fund balance as spendable or non-spendable in the governmental activities. We only recognize restrictions on net assets. Example 5. This is an example of a reciprocal exchange. In this case, the general fund is billed $1 million for services from the city's water enterprise fund. So that in effect, the general fund is purchasing water from the water enterprise, and in this case has received a bill of $1 million. So in this case, the general fund, which is the purchasing fund, recognizes the transaction as an expenditure and recognizes the fact that it now has a bill in hand by recording an amount due to other funds of $1 million. This is a payable. In the Water Enterprise Fund, the Water Enterprise Fund recognizes a receivable due from other funds of $1 million and recognizes revenues or charges for services of $1 million. Just as if really it had sold the water to an outside party, where it would also recognize revenues or charges for services and would recognize an account receivable. Again, because the general fund is a governmental fund and the Water Enterprise Fund is an enterprise fund, this is a transaction between the governmental activities and the business type activities, and we need to make an entry in those activities. So in this case, for the governmental activities, the use of the water is an expense, and the payable to the business activities is recognized using the account internal balances. In the business type activities, the receivable from the government activities is recognized using the account internal balances. And the revenue is recognized again with a revenue charge for services, just like it was in the enterprise fund. So again, I suggest that you go back and look at the PowerPoint deck in more detail and study each of these examples and post any questions you have in our discussion area.